Hey everyone, it's Reed. Before we get started, today's conversation is going to take us in a new direction, and I think that's what we need more of. I hope that when you come to the home front, you're being challenged in the things that you've thought about, given opportunities to think about things in a new way, and start to join the community of those of us that know that things can and should and must be better as we move into the future. And now, on with the show. Welcome back to the home front. I'm your host, Reed Galen. Today, I am so excited to welcome back journalist, political reporter, and all-around lady about town, Abby Tracy. You know her from her work in Inc. magazine, Forbes, most recently Vanity Fair, and so many other things. Today, she's coming to us from Washington, D.C. Abby, so glad to have you back.
Thank you for having me. Happy to be here.
Well, good. Well, I am so thrilled that you have joined us again. So I want to start with this. There has been, in the last 5 or 6 months, and maybe it predates that, this conception of, what's wrong with American men, especially young American men. What's happening? What's wrong with them? Where are they going? As a man of a certain age, who came up when, like you just did what you were told, or, you sort of got your rear end kicked, I'm probably less sympathetic to that. But I saw this article in The Guardian that I shared with you, and it's by a guy named Kaz Mutta. And it's the real story isn't young men supposedly voting far right. It's what young women are up to. And here's what he says, quote, "The boys are alt-right. This seems to be the new consensus on far-right politics propagated in numerous articles and podcasts. But the media's obsessive focus on the young men allegedly fueling the rise of the far-right isn't just empirically flawed. It misses a much more significant shift in public opinion among young people. While many surveys show a large gender gap in support of far-right parties and policies, it is young women who stand out as the more politically interesting demographic as they are turning in ever greater numbers towards the left." So tell us, what's going on?
What is your reaction to that, Reed?
My reaction is this, and I'm going to start with the older guys, because so many of the people I have met on this journey who are the most interesting, the most intelligent, the funniest, the most dedicated, the smartest, the most creative, the most courageous are women, almost exclusively. And my completely unscientific belief is that middle-aged white guys have given up. It's like, we're good. It's been a great 2,000 years, right? Like, maybe not economically, but politically, like, the world works for them. So, some of them tend toward some of my friends, what I call the you white guys, right? Where, like, they have everything, so they're just looking for something to fight against. And some of them are like, I just don't care. Some of them are somewhere in the middle. They're sort of like, Trump is back, so they've got the 7th grade humor that they can now, reimagine. But for me, the young men thing, I was at a 4th of July barbecue, and I was talking to a friend's son, and he works back in Washington, D.C. He's a guy who grew up in a very, I don't want to say progressive, but let's say democratic household. And he went to college and works on Capitol Hill and is now a diehard conservative. And when I say diehard, I mean across the board, socially, economically, every other thing. He would not date a woman who is a liberal. He listens to exclusively right-wing content. And he has what I think is probably, from my perspective, a fairly narrowed worldview. I don't find that particularly interesting. Do I find it alarming? I guess, just because of the transformation that occurred with him in 4 years. But again, I don't know. I mean, are we really supposed to say women are achieving higher levels of educational attainment, professional attainment, financial attainment, personal satisfaction, and that's a bad thing? That's where I sort of come down on it, whether it's young, middle-aged, or old. I'm a little bit, I don't know. And again, I'm not a young man anymore, and I'm certainly not a young woman. So
You are a father of 2 daughters.
I am a father of 2 daughters who are much smarter than I am, thank God, although not a high bar. And so do I want a world in which they are in some way held back from what they want to do because their male peers are either unable, unwilling, or somehow being coached in some way to not keep up? I don't know. That's why I wanted to have you on, because I needed some new brain power.
it's curious to me that you engaged with this individual who said they won't date a liberal woman. Because over the weekend, I was actually talking to one of my closest friends. She's brilliant, she's beautiful, and she was talking to me about the fact that she was at a wedding this past weekend, and somebody came up to her while she was chatting it up with somebody, and one of her friends was like, "You have to stop saying you won't date Trumpers." They're like, "That's why you're single, because you won't date a MAGA person." And she looked at them and she goes, "I have no problem being single." And she's like, "Also, why would I want to date somebody whose beliefs, like, are so diametrically opposed to what I believe?" But it's still this idea where, you have, this individual that you're speaking to, and people don't necessarily blink an eye at the fact that he's like, "I won't date liberal women," but for her, they're aghast that she won't date somebody who supports Trump. When in reality, it just all kind of circles back to this idea that there still is this double standard a little bit around it, and the idea that, you know, men kind of have the choice and women should be married, should be having families and all of this stuff. I know that sounds kind of strange, but even in the framing of this article, that's kind of how I feel, because when you think about it, logically, why wouldn't women be turning further to the left when our generation and the generations behind us currently now have fewer rights than our mothers did? Like, of course, when we're seeing our rights stripped away, particularly around the fall of Roe v. Wade and all of that, like, why wouldn't we kind of skew to the other side? So the idea that, we're turning left at a higher degree or a higher rate than young male men, it makes sense, because our rights, when you think about reproductive rights in particular, they're being stripped away, wherein their rights are, the same. So of course that gap, that delta between, the political parties and the political leanings, it just logically makes sense. So I guess the idea wherein, we should be paying closer attention to why women are turning to the left and, becoming more liberal. I think there's a real, very easy connection, a very easy through line between the policies that we've seen over the last couple of years and the Supreme Court rulings, and where political identities are falling among women right now. I actually still believe that it is far more interesting to understand and unpack why men, even if at a smaller rate, even if the delta is smaller, why they're turning further right. And I think that's something to explore. And I think there's a lot of factors at play. One, I do think that young men in particular need outlets that aren't necessarily siloed social media networks and, just consuming certain media entirely, whether it's like the Joe Rogan podcast or other very, far right sources. I think it's far more fascinating to unpack that, because I think there's a very clear reason as to why young women are turning to the left. I still, even reading that article, like, I still want to figure out why young men are turning further right, and would love to kind of hear your thoughts as somebody who was a young man. Sorry, Reed. I didn't mean that in a bad way, but I would love to hear your thoughts as to why we're seeing that, why we are seeing, and they were a consequential voting bloc during this past election.
This young man I spoke with, he loves the Michael Knowles podcast, again, a right-wing podcaster. And if you look at the Apple Top 100 overall podcasts or the Top 100 news, right, there are usually more right-ish, MAGA-ish podcasts than there are lefty podcasts. I was talking to another guy who was relating a story about his 8-year-old son, who said something, I can't remember exactly what it was, but it was so crazy, sort of magnified. And the guy said, "Where did you hear that?" And he said, "Oh, I saw it on YouTube." And so, we should not forget that, one, the people who are espousing these ideals are very well funded. They are rapacious, and the algorithms favor that kind of stuff. They also do a very good job of, it's like the cooking show, right? So you're like, okay, we're going to make pan-fried salmon. Okay, so you got your salmon, you got your garlic, and they're like, by the way, did you know we don't like people who aren't white? But let's get back to cooking, right? So like they drop these little noxious breadcrumbs into stuff. Then again, I think part of it too is that the expectation has fallen away, that you should expect that you can, and Adam Kinzinger and I have talked about this. there is a difference between being an asshole as a man, being quote unquote toxically masculine, and masculinity. Those two things are not necessarily the same. I also tend to think that I am going to be a toxic male. I think it's important for young men to get in a fight and to lose. And I'm talking about like a fist fight. I really do think it's important. But, in seventh grade, you'd go out and there'd be, two guys, and who knows what the beef was. And they'd throw about 30 seconds worth of haymakers. One guy would sort of be declared the winner. Everybody would walk off with him. And the loser would have a couple of buddies who walked off with him. But the next day, like, nobody cared, right? It was a moment in time, but it was a weird rite of passage. And so sometimes I think we're denying our sort of evolutionary things. You mentioned outlets, but those outlets then become, toxic in and of themselves. I mean, how many videos have I watched or things I saw? I saw a woman who was talking about, she was a youth jujitsu coach. And there was a meet they had, and the parents were screaming and carrying on about every call they didn't like and every time their kid lost a fight and everything. And again, so I think that the parents have a lot of responsibility in this too, which is they're going to often model the behavior they see. They are sponges. And if you allow them to say and do crazy things, I'm talking about kids, especially young men and boys who are at home. I'm not, once they go to college or once they leave the house, sort of the wilds of the world will affect them. But I think there's an expectation too of like, no, your kid's not always right. Your kid's, okay, great. Your kid plays soccer. Your kid's on the travel soccer team. Your kid's not going to UNC to play soccer, right? They're not playing D1 soccer. And so I think there's also this unreality that so many parents, I think, feel like they have to build their kids, especially their sons, up into, that once that unreality, i.e. when I was 15 and realized that I could not hit a curveball, and that was the effective end of my baseball career, you have to get over it. You have to say, okay, I want to be first baseman for the San Francisco Giants. That's not going to happen. What am I going to do now? And so there's this inability or unwillingness to prepare for a life that is not going to be all things all the time. This very negative reaction when that happens, and then going classically to look for someone to blame.
One of the things about that a little bit that is curious to me is, look, it hasn't ever been acceptable for women to, throw punches and do it. We've always been operating on this level where we can't resort to physical violence in terms of like social norms. And that's fine. But we've already adapted. And this idea that young men in particular, young boys, are being like stripped away of evolutionary options because like maybe they're not allowed to fight physically anymore or get their ass kicked is silly, because women have been figuring it out. Young girls have been figuring it out. And even just anecdotally, I think that two things can exist at once. Look, my cousin is raising two beautiful children. When he was a little younger, he absolutely loved Frozen, and he dressed up as one of the princesses. Also, kid is completely unstoppable in jujitsu and kicks ass every tournament and wins every one. Like, these things aren't necessarily black and white and mutually exclusive. I think what it comes down to is parenting and learning how to treat people with respect and getting away from this idea of how are we trying to fit people into these certain categories. Look, growing up, I was fortunate to have parents that raised me as they would have if they had a son. I recall being in the third grade and my parents not pushed me, but I wanted to be, there's an Abraham Lincoln play. All right. Also, I was the shortest kid. I know I'm on video right now, but I'm 5 feet tall and I've always been the shortest kid in the class. But I was in the third grade and I wanted to be Abraham Lincoln in the Abraham Lincoln play. And boys at the time were like, you can't be Abraham Lincoln. You're not a boy. And my parents were like, what are they talking about? Just learn the lines better than everybody else. I was the shortest kid in class, tallest president, and I got it. I got the part because I learned the lines better. But my parents raised me to never think that I couldn't play Abraham Lincoln in the play. It cuts both ways. The other thing, I had a seventh grade gym teacher, and not to be braggadocious when I say this, but I went on to run Division I cross country. I finished Leadville, have run a 3:05 marathon. I'm a good runner, but I had a middle school teacher believe that I cheated in a mile run because I beat boys and he slapped an extra minute onto my time. I did not cheat in this race. And again, like I went on to be a very successful runner. And the nonsense is like my dad, when he found out that this gym teacher slapped a minute onto my mile time, he was about to go sue people, like burn it down because he was like, you didn't cheat. He's like, I know you kicked their ass. And like the reality is you can have it both ways. Like there aren't these things, but one of the things my parents did teach me was, well, one, education matters, books matter, reading matters, and treating other people with respect really, really matters. So this idea that like boys today are having a hard time because they can't get in fist fights or like girls are their equals now, I just don't have time for it. And maybe that's because of how I was raised. But like the idea that even around these statistics, we're like, we need to point out how women are going further to the left than men going further to the right as reason for the political environment and sort of the political decisions and voting patterns that we're seeing today is nonsense to me a little bit. And I'm sorry, hot take, but like I don't have time for it. Like I just don't.
But maybe that is something that, as we bring that together, is that young men are not, whether or not it's the information they're consuming or their environments they're in, are having a hard time with that. Again, as I said at the top, why are we worried that girls, young women, and women are achieving these higher levels of attainment and men aren't? Like, I thought that was the whole point, was that, to your point, like, it doesn't matter. Man, woman, you take a test, you run a race, right? Whatever it is, you do the thing you do and you do it better, or you do it as well. And that in most things, a man or a woman can do the job. I think there's also a piece of this, which is, a lot of the jobs that are available to young men that don't require, say, a college degree, most of them are going to be in the trades, something like that. We have devalued socially and culturally. And I say this in their eyes, but I think also, do you think that's true in the eyes of women too? Which is, if I'm a guy who graduates high school, I'm a carpenter, I'm a plumber, I'm a welder, I'm an electrician, and let's say I pull down $100,000 a year, but I live in the greater Washington, D.C. area, right? Is a woman who went to college going to date me? Even though, I mean, maybe I'm tall enough because I can stand on my wallet, but I'm a blue collar guy. Is that something that a woman who's gone to college is going to be okay with? I'm asking the question because I don't know, but I think that we have devalued the value of work in many ways, and the value of, it's not about what you do, it's about who you are. But now we've wrapped all these things together. So there's a social value to some things and a devaluing socially in other things.
I don't think you're wrong in that there has been sort of that devaluing around certain careers and industries. But my counterpoint to that is think back. Think back to when you're looking at these jobs, whether it's like machinists, welders, individuals who are working at these places. Think about how women were cut out of those jobs and out of those jobs that really were the highest paying, had union backing, very difficult to get fired from, were solid jobs. And women were forced out of them. And where were women pushed? They were pushed into the softer, quote unquote, sciences, to academia, to all of these things. Women were cut out of those. And now, the fact that men are a little mad that they might not be able to, these jobs that used to be very lucrative and very supportive, like have gone away due to automation, not because of women, but due to automation and technological advances and all of that. Like the fact that you can't blame women for that. That is just an industrial evolutionary thing. And I understand that it is very difficult right now. It is incredibly difficult to have a salary that supports not only yourself right now, but supports your family. It's hard to buy houses. Equity is, especially among a certain, so I'm a millennial. We like do not have equity. Like we really don't own homes. We don't have all these things where the generations prior to us, like they really, really did. And it is absolutely difficult. I'm not discounting that. But the reality is like it has nothing to do with women like becoming more educated or turning to the left or anything like that, but just truly the fact that this country needs to start reinvesting in youth, both men, women. And I think the problem is we're not. It comes down to education. Like, I remember in high school, and Reed, you probably even to a further degree, there were classes that were constantly, focused around some of these trades. Like, we had auto body shop and all of these things that now have probably been, taken over by automation. But like, I think that we need vocational training at the high school level that reflects the current economies. And like, that's the problem, is we're really not investing in the education of people. I think this idea, when we're getting caught up in terms of gender and, men, women, or transgender, or, all of these things, what we're really missing is the plot. And the plot is, we need to educate people better for the changing industrial and economic environment and the landscape that the United States is in currently, particularly post globalization. And like, that's what it comes down to. This idea, when we're getting caught up in these kind of quasi fights around, transgendered athletes competing. Like, that's not the problem. That is a wedge issue that is being weaponized to cause chaos and cause consternation and dissension within the country, where we really need to be focusing on, okay, there is a major gap in the country where no longer, even if you have a college degree, does it guarantee that you have a job that you can support a family on, that you can buy a house with, that you can buy a car with, and what we really need to focus on is, okay, how do we adapt our education system and kind of this broader system and these dynamics to adapt to what has been fundamentally changed from an economic standpoint in our country. And we have to stop picking fights over gender and transgendered or bathrooms or all of these things. Like, you're missing the plot when we're talking about that.
You brought it back down to brass tacks, and I think that's an important thing. For me, there's that expression, right? Education is the one thing they can never take from you. And again, from a devaluing position, we have devalued as a country public education, primary education, middle school education, high school education. I was in Blacksburg, Virginia 2 weeks ago doing a town hall meeting about education in rural areas. And one of the panelists was an 11th grade history teacher. And he said, by the time they get to me, I know which ones are, look, they're all going to graduate, right? When I worked for George W. Bush, we had this idea, like, we had to end, quote unquote, social promotion, which was the idea that we were just pushing kids through the assembly line to get them out of high school. I think we're back to that now. But he said, I can tell which ones care, which ones don't care, which ones have, their parents read to them, which ones, have an interest in learning. And I think about this. What do we call kids who care about school? Nerds, dorks, right? We don't appreciate the idea. And so then the teachers now become like this 11th grade teacher are trying to figure out just how to get these kids on to the next level. And they're probably stuck in, look, just as an aside, the test, the SOL test, the standards of learning test that I took in Northern Virginia. Now, I'm sure that the content has changed. They're still making kids take that, right? 35 years after I took it in a Virginia public school. And to your point about where we are, I use COVID as just a big demarcation line. If the things that we were doing before COVID, and let's just use education, weren't working, why would we believe that they're going to work after COVID when the entire world has changed? You mentioned buying a home. I was talking to a friend of mine yesterday, and he said, there are plenty of homes available, right? You can buy an affordable home. The problem is you can't do it in San Francisco. You could do it in Indianapolis, but people don't want to live necessarily in Indianapolis. No offense to our Hoosier friends out there. And that's the other part, is like the nature of work has changed. A lot of times you don't have to go to an office. The trades, service jobs are one of the few things where you actually still must be present. Just going back to what you said about what's offered in school. In 7th grade, I took Mr. White's woodshop class. And in 8th grade, I took Mr. Zabornik's metal shop class, right? How many 12-year-olds get to use an acetylene torch nowadays? Probably not that many.
I did have woodshop. It was still around when I was in there.
And in woodshop, we used jigsaws, bands, like things that would literally lop a finger off without a second thought.
We did. There was a kid that lost his finger in one of my classes, but that's a total aside.
And, and Mr. White only had 9.5 fingers. And I get like that was a joke because
it was normal.
Because it was real, right? And he'd been a shop teacher for 40 friggin' years or whatever. There was nothing wrong with dual paths, parallel paths, even multiple paths. But the bottom line was you had to have some level of education that when you left that high school, you were marketable to do something. Now, we could also make the argument, or we could ask the question, should everything be seen in the context of just simply how you contribute to the economy, right? Is that how we should see things? But how else are we going to do things, right? You got to go make a living, But we talk about like artificial intelligence and what is it going to do to, so many jobs. And to your point about how we're preparing this generation, how we're preparing your generation and those after you for the world, like we know this is coming, right? We saw massive disruption 100 plus, 125, 130 years ago with the Industrial Revolution in the UK. Then we saw another one after World War II. Then we saw another one with the internet. The difference was that the technological advancement actually led to more jobs. This is the first time where the technological advancement could lead to less jobs. So what is the throughput for actual human beings? It's all well and good to say, well, it'll do this and it'll do that. Yeah, but we're going to have, several million people sitting around going, what am I supposed to do now? And if American life is predicated on economic attainment and buying a home, and now 5 million people can't do that because what they thought they were going to do or what they trained for isn't available anymore, then how do you deal with that? Because that becomes a sociological, a cultural, an economic issue. And to your point, less people getting married, less kids, everything else. And I know that's sort of, birth rates and all that stuff is a little arcane and not exactly what we're talking about here. But I think your point is a good one, which is, shouldn't we be teaching everybody as much as we can, as well as we can? Shouldn't we have a higher expectation for ourselves? The thing that is both fascinating and frustrating to me, Abby, is that one, as Americans, we don't treat each other very well. And second, as Americans, oftentimes we don't expect enough of ourselves. That we don't expect enough of ourselves, of our neighbors, of our kids, of our communities. It's like we all just got here, or so many of us just got here, and we're on vacation. And it's like, we live here, like I live in a resort town. A lot of people move here for the lifestyle, but they never get involved in their communities. They never go to a city council meeting. They never go to a county council meeting. They never go to a water board meeting. That's fine. They don't have to. But they're visitors in the town in which they live. And I feel like a lot of Americans act like they're visitors in the country they're from.
I don't know how new that is. I do think it's gotten worse. I absolutely do. I think, the internet and social media and everything, people huddle up in their online spaces and then they connect with the people that, have like-minded views and all of this stuff. But one of the really fascinating things when I look back at how I was raised and everything. So my father, he's about older than you. In elementary school, he had dyslexia at the time. Dyslexia wasn't really diagnosed. It wasn't diagnosed the ways in which it is today. Um, and he was put in, there were different colored reading groups. Like there was like the blue group, which was slower readers, and then like the green group. And what that did was it sort of dictated your track in elementary school, which then would dictate your track in middle school and high school, on and on. I'm sure it might have been similar when you were there in school as well, Reed. But so my dad was dyslexic, undiagnosed, and he was put in the slow reading group. In the 5th grade, my father, he was fortunate enough to have a teacher who was like, hey, like, this kid doesn't need to be on this track. This kid just has dyslexia, like a reading disability. And this teacher pulled him out of it and put him on the other track, the track that would have been related to the green group or whatever it was. And it completely changed my dad's trajectory in life. He went on to become a nurse anesthetist. We had a great childhood, great upbringing, and all of this stuff. But when we were children, because of the experience that my dad went through, he was fixated on doing all of this research on all of our teachers before we entered school. And he would figure out who was the best teacher and get my sister and I and, in that group or in that class with the teacher that really cared the most in all of this. And I was so lucky. And he made reading just paramount in our households. I had to read The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings in the third grade. It was like a whole thing. I'm also a dork and a nerd, for the record. But my dad, because of his experiences, he shaped our experiences. I think one of the really difficult things is I look back on that and I feel so grateful and so lucky that I had a father that did that and that sought to make sure that we were on the right path and a path that fit us educationally. But the thing is, you wish the parent didn't necessarily have to do that, like that they didn't have to force it. Because fortunately, my dad had the bandwidth and the ability to do that, to spend that time and have the kind of network to figure out, okay, who's the good teacher? Who's the bad teacher? Not every parent can do that. And I think one of the things that's happening is like, and this continues to happen, is like kids are getting left behind because there are very different types of intelligences out there. And our system continues to not recognize them and not address them. And again, to your point, Reed, you mentioned this idea like an 11th grade teacher, he's like, pie's already cooked. Like, we already know where they're going to be. Like, it does start earlier. And I know I sound a little bit like a broken record, but so many of these things require like investing earlier and really addressing the educational systems, but also addressing them in a way that reflects our changing economies. And I know that sounds silly, but like my dad got lucky because he had one teacher who was like, no, pulled him and put him on a different path. I got lucky because that was my dad. But there are so many sort of moments or things that can control this, but I do believe it comes back to this and sort of this idea of preparing people for the real world. And it looks different now as it did when I was a kid, when it did as you were a kid, when my dad was a kid. And I just don't believe that right now the environment, the political environment is reflecting that. To circle back to your point, my dad also, one of the things that he was incredibly active in was voting in school board races, was voting for like local leaders, all of this stuff that is sort of thinking about you. And you also work for the union. Like that is a focus, sort of that like grassroots community level engagement where you're engaging on this level where it really is touching students and it really is touching, homeowners in a certain cul-de-sac or whatever it may be. But I think ultimately the problem is when we're talking about, hey, women are going so liberal, young men are going so right, and let's talk about transgendered athletes at Penn, like we're missing the point. And I think like that is what it comes back to, is we need to start investing at kind of the bare bones root level of so many of these things. And that is how you make change. I do not believe that it starts from the top down when we're talking about these wedge issues. It really comes back to people, families, students, children, and investing in them.
Think about that in so many classrooms that the desks, even in my daughter's middle school, are still set up in rows, right? Rows from front to back, rows from side to side. But what was that predicated on? A career on an assembly line, right? That you were going to be prepared to stay in one place all day. Something was going to come to you. You were going to rivet, drill, whatever it was, and it was going to move on. And that was what I was talking about with this reimagining. Why is it that we're still even setting kids like that? And I know it's not every classroom, but it's still enough of them. Why are we not asking ourselves? And this is where, if you're on the left, we have to do it this way. It's doctrinaire. And if you're on the right, it's any sort of public education is just social engineering and indoctrination and blah, 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 blah. When all of those arguments, to your point, leave out the people who are going to be affected most, which are the kids. I don't think this is a left versus right argument. I don't think it's like, oh, there's a center way. I think there's a different way. I think there's a new way. And it very well might be, because every kid is different, that maybe we can utilize technology to say, okay, if we know Abby has to get through 9th grade biology, and let's say there's 30 kids in your class, there's got to be a way for someone to come up with something that says, okay, there are 15 different ways to teach this concept. that all of these large language models and all of this other stuff, all of human history is now like in our phone, right? There's got to be different ways that people have tried this and seen it work. And you start with, okay, we're going to do this. Okay, I see that for 15 of you, this works, and 15 of you, it doesn't. Like, we're going to go to those 15 and give the teachers more flexibility, give the students more opportunity so that everything is now utilizing technology not to replace kids, but to help them advance in a way that is going to, as you said, prepare them for the real world, because the world is real and it is hard. And in America, we don't, you get out of high school, good luck. You get out of college, good luck. And I'm not saying we should have some overarching, again, social engineering, but I think we should, to your point, utilize the ages of 3 to 18 to say, okay, what do we want that human to look like when we turn them loose on the world? I don't think that's social engineering. I think, to your point, I think that's building foundations. I think that's good planning. But this is the other part that now does zoom back out, which is we have a system in which you have a whole bunch of people saying the sky is blue and a whole bunch of other people saying Mars just exploded. And you're like, what are you talking about? Mars just exploded, right? Like, there's no common argument. And I think that we lose sight of what matters, to your point. And I think that it is so easy to get caught up in those wedge issues, those very narrow bore wedge issues, because here's the other part. For the powers that be, that gives them license to not think about that, to not make the choices that might, one, offend their sensibilities, or two, upset their position in an otherwise entrenched and calcified establishment.
I do believe that the discourse around young men in this country is damaging to young men. Like, I absolutely believe that. So if I were to kind of come up with like a commensurate example, I grew up in the 90s, 2000s. And, every magazine on the front was like, how to lose 5 to 10 pounds, how to lose 5 to 10 pounds on it, and that was like sort of drilled in your brain that like you were like a girl, a woman, like you needed to be skinny, you needed to be skinny. And it kind of, even if you're not realizing it, like you're absorbing this and sort of this language around like young men are bad. They are the problem. They are the reason Trump was reelected. I believe that that discourse is really, really damaging to young men. Whereas I do believe that like around young women, there is a better dialogue happening right now that's about empowerment and about opportunity and about what we deserve and education and all of these things. Whereas I do think that the discourse around young men in this country has drifted in a way that is certainly detrimental to young men, predicated on systems of the past. Like, it is not young men in America's fault that like what they're hearing is, oh, you're a young white guy, you're the problem. You're the problem. And the more people hear that, they think that they will automatically be clustered or grouped into this category. And I think it causes anger, it causes resentment. And then I think what it does is, it's almost a self-fulfilling prophecy around, if you're told you're bad enough times, you're like, okay, I'm bad. Like, I believe this. Like, I'm a bad person, especially young men, women, anyone. If you're hearing those messages at a young age, it is incredibly, incredibly influential. And I think that there does need to be a shift in the discourse around blaming young men for like the election of Trump or like all of these things that like really is unfair to sort of put on them as a burden and put them in a way that, is categorizing them as almost like evil, if that makes sense. Like, I think there needs to be a different narrative around young men in this country. Absolutely, full stop, because otherwise it's going to just feed it and, feed some of this, push individuals toward the nasty, like noxious rhetoric and, further siloification of these individuals from the rest of their communities and, family and friends and all of that. So that is like one major caveat that I want to say.
Let's go back to something you talked about too, about community. On my street, we have kids that go to 3 or 4 different schools. My kids go to the public schools. There's a couple of neighbors that send their kids to 2 different private schools. there's not that, I was lucky, right? My buddies and I, we walked to school every day, right? A mile to school every day, starting when I was in third grade. Right. And so that was what we did. That was our community. There was always somebody's, usually there was a mom home, right? That level of somebody's watching out for you and someone cares about you that's not necessarily your parents. The quote unquote non-custodial adult. I think we've lost that. I think there was a headline. This is the whitest thing I'm ever going to say, like in the Atlantic, right? Like,
Are you sure?
well, that's true. That's a pretty bold statement. You're fair enough. Like they used to see kids on bikes. You don't see that anymore. Is the world a scarier place than it was when we were kids? Maybe, maybe not. But given, as you said, the preponderance of social media, it sure looks scarier because every piece of bad news that might have happened in St. Paul, Minnesota, now ends up in Washington, D.C., too. Right. The boundaries between those worlds have been completely shattered. So every piece of bad news is now everybody's bad news. And for young men, there are differences, right? I mean, we shouldn't deny the differences between a young man and a young woman. There's a study that says young men should start school a year later, right? My daughters are almost 13 and almost 15. Like, they're like, why do boys act that way? I'm like, let's be clear. Like, we're sort of always going to act that way. Right. Like, it's never, we're always going to think the same silly jokes are funny. We're always going to be doofy. Right. Like, that's just the nature of, sometimes how we are. That's okay. But I think there's also this intentional, like, let's divide everybody else up by one more thing. Right. As opposed to saying, let's take care of our kids regardless. It's here's young men, here's young women. Let's put them on one track, them on another track. They're right, they're wrong, they're doing well, they're doing badly. When, to your point, generationally, your generation is going to have a much harder time buying a house than mine did. The Gen Z folks are going to have a much harder time even than you do. And the Gen Alphas, who are just now being born, right, who knows what the hell the world's going to look like for them.
You're absolutely right. And I think this language should be like, empowering language, or like you can achieve, and like all of that stuff should be distributed equally. Like, I do think the discourse around young men in this country is bad. I do think it's toxic, and I do think it is a real problem, as is like the discussion around wedge issues. But I also think, it's never been, and I know you're not saying this, but it's also never been perfect, but the language was just different prior. So, like, growing up, both my parents worked. They were both in the medical industry, but my mom, she had to travel a lot for work. And my dad, he was typically the one at just by nature of my mom's schedule, he was typically the one at my soccer games or my parent teacher conferences and all of these things. Whereas many of the other mothers in my neighborhood on my cul-de-sac did not work. They did not have jobs. And they were very much present all the time, omnipresent, kind of stay-at-home mom type figures. And I recall being almost bullied for the fact that my mom wasn't around because she had a career of her own, and not by other kids necessarily, but by other parents. Like, I have very vivid memories of being in like the fourth and fifth grade at like an art show or a parent teacher conference where other parents would come up to me and they'll be like, Abby, where's your mom? Oh, is she not coming? Like, is she not here? And I'm like, my dad's here. Like, it's cool, but it was a thing. And I think like that really affected me as a kid. The fact that like people planted in my head that they're like, your mom's not here. My mom was at everything she could have been at. Absolutely. If she was home, she would have been at my soccer games. If she was doing this, but my dad was there, my dad was cooking dinner, and sort of this notion of roles or boxes that we're trying to put people in. I think it's shifted a little bit in the way in which we're doing it today, but it has always been problematic. And I think that's the issue, is like, we have to stop trying to define people by like, oh, you're a young man in America, like you're a young woman in America, like blah, 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 blah. Because frankly, I was hella lucky with my parents growing up. My mom and dad were incredible, incredible parents. But the fact that I was a kid in elementary school made to feel bad that my mom wasn't there because my mom was out working, being actually the breadwinner of the household, is messed up. Like, that is absolutely messed up. And by adults, not other kids, because they didn't know what was going on, but like adults. And so I do think that there is this kind of need to strip away again, like these wedge issues and kind of once again, like we got to stop trying to confine people and like focus on what really matters. And like, I do believe it comes back to like opportunity, education, and like being nice to people. Like, stop being mean. Like, people are being mean.
That's what I was going to say, and you beat me to the punch, which is we often forget that each one of us is just trying to figure out how to get through the day. And I will say this, I am blessed. Most people, I would say, have a harder time trying to figure out what that means than I do. I am blessed and lucky to be able to have conversations like this with folks like you when other people, have a much harder time of it, whether that's their fault or not. Before we let you go, where can everybody find you online?
You can find me on Twitter at Abigail Tracy and on Instagram at Abby Tracy.
All right. As always, gang, you can find me on says.us, Twitter, and TikTok at Reed Galen, on Threads and Instagram at Reed_Galen USA, and of course over at Substack, The Homefront. Abby, thanks for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me.
And everybody else, we'll see you next time.